the night of May 23rd, 2023, a U-Haul truck crashed into barriers at Lafayette Park, just across the street from the White House. A 19-year-old deluded man, Cy Kandula, emerged from the vehicle without a weapon, and he was soon arrested. Later, while he was being interrogated, Cy confessed his intention was to take over the White House and seize control of the nation, stating he would even go so far as to assassinate the president, if it came to it. Cy Kandula's attempt was as inglorious as it was impossible to achieve, though whether he knew it or not, his name had just been added to the long and old list of failed assassins. It's fascinating to think that of all the assassination plots that have come to pass through history, many were unsuccessful, and most are probably not even known about. In this video, I'll be retelling 3 instances in which an assassin sought to take the life of a powerful figure, and how each of them failed. In the spring of 1272, King Edward I of England, then only a prince, was on crusade in the Holy Land. Muslim forces were in control of Jerusalem, and the Crusaders were on the back foot. The year prior, King Louis IX of France, the leader of the crusade, had died of illness in North Africa, and a storm off the coast of Sicily had dissuaded any further reinforcements from Christendom. Led by the Mamluk Sultan Baibars, the Muslim forces had gained the upper hand over the Crusaders, driving them back to the stronghold of Acre. Despite the help of Prince Edward and his soldiers, Acre and its garrison would stand little chance against the Muslims, should Baibars decide to besiege them. Hugh III, King of Cyprus and the nominal King of Jerusalem, and thus the leader of the Crusaders in Acre, saw no way out of the situation he now found himself in. In May of the year 1272, he signed a peace treaty with Baibars that was to last 10 years. Prince Edward of England, having only just arrived in the Holy Land, was less willing to make peace with the conquering Baibars. Edward was a fighting man in his early 30s, and he had come a long way to be here. Though he'd participated in a few raids and attacks against the Muslims, he had yet to experience a real victory in the Holy Land. The Crusaders in Acre and Baibars had been warring with each other for years now, and they were ready for a decade of peace. The Crusaders were worn out and couldn't hold out much longer, and Baibars needed to secure his border so he could focus on the threat of the Mongols to the north. Prince Edward of England, however, was not yet ready to make peace. Baibars would make him ready. Late one night in June of the year 1272, Prince Edward was awoken from his sleep to hear an urgent message. The messenger was a Muslim man who had converted to Christianity, and whom Edward may have known, perhaps having received messages from him in the past. Pulling aside his bedsheets and rising with only his night clothes on, Edward met with the messenger, though what they discussed is not known. What is known is the messenger was actually a spy, an assassin, possibly from the elite and mysterious Order of Assassins. Pulling a dagger from his clothes, the assassin attacked Prince Edward, though if he had wanted an easy mark, he should have attacked while the prince was still asleep. Edward was tall, later earning the name of Longshanks, and he was a fearsome warrior. Even half asleep and wearing nothing but a nightshirt, Prince Edward of England was no easy target. A 14th century chronicle called The Templar of Tyre describes the scene thusly. The Saracen met him and stabbed him on the hip, making a deep and dangerous wound. The Lord Edward felt himself struck, and he struck the Saracen a blow with his fist on the temple, which knocked him senseless to the ground for a moment. The Lord Edward caught up a dagger from the table which was in the chamber, and stabbed the Saracen in the head, and killed him. Suffering a wound, Edward beat back his would-be assassin and killed the man, possibly with his own dagger. Some accounts say that the wound Edward suffered was to his arm and not his hip, and the blade wielded by the assassin may have been poisoned. Some legends tell how Edward's wife, Eleanor, sucked the poison from the wound, while other, more believable accounts tell how a doctor was summoned to treat the prince. In any case, Prince Edward had not only survived, but he had killed the man sent to kill him. Still, the message Baibars had hoped to send was received. Wounded and possibly recovering from poison, Edward no longer objected to peace with Baibars. In September, Prince Edward left the Holy Land to return home, and while he stopped in Sicily, he learned that his father, King Henry III, had died, and that he, Edward, was now King Edward. On the 30th of January, 1835, an English-American house painter named Richard Lawrence was sitting in his paint shop in Washington, D.C., and he was muttering to himself. It wasn't the first time. In recent months, his strange behavior had gotten gradually worse. His mental state, perhaps affected by the toxic chemicals in the paint with which he worked, had spiraled. Sitting with a book forgotten in his lap, the painter suddenly started laughing to himself. What was so funny, only he knew. Then he stopped laughing, lurched to his feet, and left the paint shop saying, "I'll be damned if I don't do it." Later that day, Lawrence walked to the U.S. Capitol building, where a funeral was being held for a Senator Warren R. Davis from South Carolina. Standing in the cold, he positioned himself beside a pillar along the Capitol building's east portico, and there he waited for his mark. Among his many delusions, Richard Lawrence believed that he was the King of England, and that he was owed a huge sum of money. He needed this money so he could purchase a ship, hire a captain, and sail back to the country of his birth, where he would then presumably take on his responsibilities as king. His mental state notwithstanding, there was one major obstacle preventing Richard from receiving the money he needed to achieve all of this. The banks couldn't pay him. President Andrew Jackson had declared war on the Second Bank of the United States, and he was winning. Richard Lawrence needed that bank so he could get the fortune he thought he was owed. With President Jackson out of the way, the war on the banks would end, and Richard would be free to carry out his plans to return to England. Leaving the funeral of Senator Warren R. Davis, President Andrew Jackson and his retinue walked along the Capitol building's east portico. As the president passed by him, Richard Lawrence stepped out and raised his Derringer single-shot pistol at President Jackson's back. He aimed, then squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun had misfired. The hammer had closed and the cap had fired with a crack. Smoke had filled the air, but the powder of the shot had not ignited. No bullet left the gun. Reacting in an instant, Richard Lawrence drew out his second pistol that he had brought for just such an eventuality. By now the crowd around him was reacting, as was the president himself. Jackson turned to see Lawrence aiming the gun right at him. They were only a few feet away from each other. There was no way Lawrence would miss. Then he pulled the trigger. Again, another misfire. President Andrew Jackson, or Old Hickory as he was called, on account of how tough he was, launched at his would-be assassin, raising his cane on high and bringing it raining down on Richard Lawrence, striking him several times as the luckless man reeled back. In the next moments, the crowd around President Jackson launched into action against Lawrence, with American folk hero Davy Crockett wrestling Lawrence to the ground and subduing him. President Andrew Jackson was a man of action. By the time of Lawrence's attempted assassination on him, Jackson had survived a host of famous battles, fought in over a dozen duels, and he'd even been shot on 2 different occasions. He was in his late 60s at this point, but he was no easy mark, and he still had the strength to swing his cane like a club. Richard Lawrence was the first man to ever attempt to assassinate a president of the United States. He was tried, and perhaps unsurprisingly, was found not guilty by reason of insanity. During his trial, he was prone to ranting and raving, still under the impression that he was the King of England. He was committed to a series of mental institutions for the rest of his life. As a final aside to this story, the prosecuting attorney in the case against Richard Lawrence was a prominent lawyer of the time, an author and an amateur poet, Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the words to the Star-Spangled Banner. In October of 1912, the then former President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, was campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Roosevelt had been president before, but had refused to run for a 3rd term in 1908, citing the tradition laid down by George Washington. Instead, he had endorsed one of his cabinet, his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, who went on to secure the presidency. But in the 4 years between 1908 and 1912, Roosevelt grew dissatisfied not only with Taft, but with the Republican Party in general. By the time of the campaigning season, Roosevelt had decided to throw aside that 2-term tradition, and he was back in the race for the presidency. Which brings us back to October 1912, specifically the 14th of October. The place is the Hotel Gilpatrick, where Roosevelt was attending a dinner hosted by one of his supporters. Leaving the hotel, Roosevelt left to give his scheduled speech. Climbing into an open-top car that was waiting for him, Theodore Roosevelt stood up, removed his hat, and waved at the assembled crowd. Then a shot rang out. 37-year-old John Fleming Schrank was a saloon keeper and a landlord who had dreamt that the assassinated president, William McKinley, had instructed him to kill Theodore Roosevelt. You may not be surprised to hear that Schrank may have been suffering from one or more mental illnesses. In any case, he acquired a gun, a .38 Special, and had began following Roosevelt's campaign trail, stalking the former president and looking for any opportunity he got to strike. When the former president left the doors of the Gilpatrick Hotel and walked to his open-top car, Schrank saw his opportunity. As the former president lifted his hat and waved to the crowd gathered around his car, Schrank, standing right beside the vehicle, only 7 feet away from Roosevelt himself, gripped his pistol in both hands, raised it, and fired a single shot. Theodore Roosevelt staggered slightly, and the car rocked as Elbert E. Martin, one of Roosevelt's secretaries and a former football player, leapt from the car in an instant, pouncing on the gunman and wresting the weapon away before another shot could ring out. In the next instant, the rest of Roosevelt's entourage were in on the action. Policemen and Rough Riders, even members of the crowd themselves, were busy trying to get their chance to strike at the man who had fired the shot. Roosevelt, unfazed, smiled reassuringly and waved his hat again, trying to calm the crowd. Though he had been shot, the bullet was lodged in his chest muscle. Roosevelt was saved from the worst of it when the bullet passed through not only his glasses case, but also a single folded copy of the 50-page speech he was planning on giving that day. Another of the president's attendants, a man called Harry Cockham, asked Roosevelt if he had been hit. "He pinked me, Harry," Roosevelt replied simply. Meanwhile, Schrank was being beaten mercilessly as he was pulled to his feet. The crowd was calling for mob justice. They cried for Schrank's death at the noose, calling for him to be lynched then and there. Roosevelt, however, seeing what was happening, calmed the crowd with another wave of his hat and a reassuring call. "Bring him here," Roosevelt said, gesturing to the subdued man. "Bring him here. I want to see him." The crowd, seeing Roosevelt was not dead, but was in fact alive and well, cheered as the gunman was brought before the former president and made to face the man he had just tried to assassinate. Theodore Roosevelt reached out and grabbed John Schrank by the face, turning it to see whether or not he knew the man. When he didn't recognize the face, Roosevelt asked, "What did you do it for?" John Schrank had no response. "Oh, what's the use?" Roosevelt huffed. "Turn him over to the police." Just before Schrank was led away from the car, Theodore Roosevelt looked down at him and said, "You poor creature." John Schrank was then taken away and showered in boos and taunts from the crowd, all while cheers and applause rang out for the chivalrous Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had spent his life shooting things. He'd killed animals from North Dakota to Khartoum, and he knew when a bullet was life-threatening and the one that was in his chest wasn't. He'd surmised that since he wasn't coughing up blood, the bullet hadn't reached his lung. So he declined an immediate visit to the hospital, shrugging it off as secondary to delivering that speech he was here to deliver. His doctors protested, but Roosevelt would not be talked down, and he proceeded to give a 90-minute-long speech to the assembled crowd, all while his shirt filled with blood. Opening the speech, Roosevelt said, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." After the speech, Roosevelt was seen by his doctors, who concluded that the bullet was lodged in the muscles of his chest, and that the process of removing it would likely be more harmful than leaving it there. Theodore Roosevelt survived the rest of his life with that bullet in him, later telling a friend that it bothered him no more than if it were in his pocket. As for John Fleming Schrank, he actually pled guilty to the charges laid against him. However, it was quickly determined that he was in fact insane, and in 1914 he was admitted to a mental institution, where he lived the rest of his life, dying 29 years later in 1943. By the way, Roosevelt's opponents in the presidential race, both William Howard Taft and the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson, suspended their campaigns while Roosevelt recovered from the shooting. Imagine that sort of thing happening today. Theodore Roosevelt had been shot from as near as 7 feet away, but he had been saved by his glasses case, a written speech, and a quick-acting former football player. John Schrank, meanwhile, had just added his name to the long and old list of failed assassins. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like or a comment or subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a lot and lets me know what sort of content you want to see. I'll see you in the next one.